So let me begin by acknowledging two things. First, we're doing this Zoom talk, and let's be honest, it's not the same. I wish I were in the place that you wanted to be, in my Puerto Rico querido, and I wish that doing these presentations would be like explosive, animated, etc. But most of the time, we end up in boring, which is the name of a town in Oregon. And I'm good, but I don't think I'm Black Puerto Rican Superman. But I'll do my best to keep you alive and still convey a number of important matters. The second thing I want to alert you is the obvious, which is that talking about racism these days is quite sensitive, as many whites particularly feel attacked. But my primary goal today is educational. I want you to end my discussion by having a better understanding about what racism is all about, how it works in contemporary America, and appreciate its systemic nature. Of course, if you are moved by what I say, think about changing some of your practices, either personally or in your organization or in both. And I want you to relax, as one of my big points today will be that most of us are sort of unconscious, habituated participants in systemic racism. So relax, but do not relax too much, yeah? So we have work to do. So this is what I'm going to do today. First, I will examine and define what I mean by systemic racism. Second, I will address the nature of systemic racism in the post-civil rights era. Third, I will address the ideological expression of the new system, which I call in my work colorblind racism. Then I'll give you one example of how systemic racism gets embedded in organizations by discussing briefly HWCUs, or historically white colleges and universities. And lastly, I'll get in deep waters, but we're among friends, so we can do this together, and analyze and explain how we all participate in systemic racism, and end by discussing what things we might consider doing to move to a more racially just society. So what is systemic racism? In the past, it was easy. It's the bad guys, it's the Klan, and some people still think it's the neo-Klan, and it has become normative to call that the bad apple theory of racism, yeah? To alert you, again, my big point today is that systemic racism is ultimately reproduced by the actions and inactions of most of us in society. And I will try to explain the difference between the participation of whites and non-whites, because I want to make clear that our participation is not symmetrical. It's not the same to be at the top of a system than at the bottom of a system. Now, these days, everybody is talking about systemic racism. Recently, candidate Biden used the term. And I want to suggest that most people using the term do not know what they're talking about. So, for example, Biden said in the debate that police departments have systemic racism, and immediately qualified his statement by saying, but most police officers are not racist, therefore reverting again to the notion of racism as a matter of bad apples. In truth, if you want to think systemically, you have to understand that the selection of police officers, the training they receive, the culture they have, the racialized authority, and the militarization of the police apparatus all but guarantee that officers, even the good ones, will carry out race-based policing. And I wanted to give you a liminal example to illustrate how systemic racism operates in police departments. So this is a young African-American from Atlanta, Georgia, who was brutalized by police officers in June. And these are the officers who brutalized him. And some of you probably are already thinking, but how can Black people? And the answer is that first, Black and white officers are as likely to use lethal force against people of color. And this is because from the get-go, from slavery onwards, although most Blacks have not participated or supported systemic racism, we have had Blacks who have participated. I'll give you more examples later on, and that continues today. In general, the enforcement of racial order is done by whites, not all of them dressing as police officers. Some are RWF, regular white folks, who discipline black and brown folks in all sorts of environments and places. Thankfully, whites are divided and they're not a monolith. And in recent times, we have witnessed how some are fighting against systemic racism. So then what is it? And I want to address three components of a good definition of systemic racism. First, it has to be historically specific. Although systemic racism is a feature of the world system since modernity, since the 1500s, you got to understand that every society developed a peculiar or a variation of systemic racism. So we have racism in Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Brazil, Canada, France, and the US, but their racisms, their systems are related but somewhat different. And you have to be also able to address how systemic racism works in different periods. So in the US case, for example, the slavery system was the beginning and then morphed into the Jim Crow period. And today, as I will mention, we have a new system of racial domination. Secondly, the definition has to include this idea that the practices of racial domination are collective, and therefore you have collective practices, behavior, and culture that reproduce disadvantage for some and advantage for others at all levels. And this is the hardest part of the definition, which is if we have a system of domination, whether we call it capitalism or patriarchy, or the case in point today, systemic racism, those systems are in place because they provide material advantage to some, and therefore those people try to defend the system. Accordingly, systemic racism is societies where social, political, economic, cultural, and even psychological rewards are partially allocated by race. And I say partially because we all know that as central as race has been to modernity, is not the only axis of division. We also have gender, class, and sexual orientation as central factors of social stratification. Therefore, systemic racism is about collective practices and behaviors rather than a matter of a few races. If you want more on the theoretical thinking on systemic racism, see my Rethinking Racism article, 1997, in the American Sociological Review. I'm getting self-referential. I keep citing myself. Okay, so although systemic racism is systemic, I want to address the specifics of the US case, yeah? So in the US, we all know we had slavery, and we have the conquest and genocide experienced by indigenous peoples. And we also have the land theft. We took half of what was Mexico in the 19th century, we took, and contemporarily today, a third of the US territory is or used to be Mexico until the 1840s. And although we don't talk about it, the US is an empire, and it has been so since the 19th century. Actually, arguably since the beginning of the formation of the state, because when we were moving from the 13 colonies west, we were taking land away from indigenous peoples, and that is classic colonialism. And of course, we also have colonialism outside the nation state, and we control places like Guam or Puerto Rico. So here you have a picture of President Trump in Puerto Rico. And as you learned recently, he thought of divesting from Puerto Rico. He considered us, a people, an asset, and contemplated even trading Puerto Rico for Greenland. And racialization, the extension of racial meaning to people and categories, continues. So it's a continuous process. We still have racialization as an ongoing process. The foundation of the system is material, and material is both economic, and I'll give you examples of non-economic. The economic stuff we all know. Whites in the labor market make more money than non-whites, controlling for all kinds of characteristics. And the most important example of economic inequality is wealth. As you can see in this figure, in the 1980s, Blacks and Latinos had about 15% the net worth of whites. And as we move forward to the 2016 period, that ratio has increased. So today, Blacks and Latinos are less wealthy relative to whites. So why these economic disparities? It is not due to education, effort, lack of interest or culture, but because race matters in all areas of life, including jobs. So race matters when you work in Wendy's or Burger King, you're a janitor or work at Walmart, you work in the meatpacking industry, you're a doctor or a lawyer, or you're a plumber and an electrician. And just let me take that as an example. So as we all know, plumbers and electricians are actually it's a working class occupation, but it pays quite well. And I checked this morning data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Blacks and Latinos are severely underrepresented in these good jobs. So the question is, why? Why would Blacks and Latinos be underrepresented in working class jobs that pay quite well? And the answer is racialized networks. In order for you to be a plumber or an electrician, you have to go to a trade school. And after you're in the trade school, you become an apprentice to someone. So in the trade school, race works like kinship. So your teachers are not referring you to licensed plumbers and electricians, and the licensed plumbers and electricians who are mostly white tell teachers in the schools that they don't want to be working with Blacks and Latinos. Again, I put a slide of a book that addresses this specifically through ethnographic work. And of course, in the academy, we think that we're beyond, and as we all know, we're not. Race matters in the academy too. Now, I said that material interest drives systemic racism, but I want to get us away from an economic reading of interest to a view that is plural. The economic stuff matters, but by material, I mean more than just economic matters, because after all, humans do not live on bread alone. Therefore, our racialized order gives whites preferential access to neighborhoods, colleges, and parks, better social estimation, given that the culture heralds whiteness. If you are white, the police is on your side. And I wanted to give you a clear example. So on the left, you have here Dylan Roof, the young white fellow who murdered 9 people in a church in South Carolina. So he was arrested without incident, even though he was armed and he had killed 9 people. On the way to the police station, he complained that he was hungry, and the police stopped at Burger King and got him a burger. On the right, you have the picture of George Floyd, who was tortured and ended up killed after 8 minutes and 46 seconds of having this police officer's knee on his neck. If you are white, you can barbecue in a park, watch birds in a park, sell water or lemonade in a stand, sleep on a couch at Yale, speak Spanish in New York City. Without concern, someone will tell you, you cannot do that here. And here is another example that besides police officers imposing or policing Black and brown communities and Black and brown folks, here you have regular white folks engaging in behavior to defend the racial order of things. So not surprisingly, whites as a collectivity, as a group, have an interest in keeping things as they are. However, as I mentioned already, whites also have internal divisions, and some of them are fighting to change the racial order of things in America. So what is the nature of contemporary systemic racism? I think some people think that racism is racism, and it's the same across periods. And I want to suggest that once a new system of practices emerges, you got to understand the practices and the ideology that supports the new system. So in the contemporary era, I have labeled in my work this system as the new racism to refer to the mostly subtle, seemingly non-racial practices that emerged in the 1970s to reproduce race inequality. And they begin with the new character of discrimination, the now you see it, now you don't, or smiling discrimination that happens to us when we go to a store and we are followed or politely asked 3-4 times, may I help you? May I help you? May I help you? In my case, I still recall being asked in 3 different stores for additional IDs before they could accept my checks. Back in the day, young people in the audience, some people used to pay with checks. Secondly, the avoidance of racial terminology. Third, a racial agenda that avoids directness. So people talk about welfare reform, inner city problems. We have developed a whole language of race without using direct terminology. Mechanisms that are invisible to most of us, and I'm going to give you one that used to be invisible and has become visible, which is police surveillance and brutality. So here you have the case of Eric Garner that we all remember. And that would have been invisible to most of us, except that the revolution in cell technology, cellular phones, have made visible what used to be invisible. Unfortunately, now we also have data that even though we have these videos that keep emerging again and again and again, it has not changed the fundamentals of police surveillance and brutality. They're still monitoring and patrolling communities of color, and they're still killing folks of color. And lastly, any system of domination, but it also takes some of the old ideas and practices and re-articulates them. So a good example is the case of redlining. So redlining refers to a practice that banks have used for forever, for probably 100 years, and basically is that if you come from a poor minority community and apply for a loan, even if your credentials are similar to those of a white applicant, you are offered an inferior product. Makes it much harder for you to get a loan and purchase a home, which, by the way, is the #1 asset in terms of wealth accumulation. So new racism affects all areas of life. It works in housing and schools. And I want to remind you that in the Jim Crow era, the practices of exclusion in neighborhoods were overt and brutal. So whites burned crosses in the front yards of Black families attempting to move into a white community, or they planted bombs. Here you have a picture of a bomb in Birmingham, Alabama. They also had these housing covenants which restricted who could buy or rent properties in white communities. Interestingly, when I moved to Texas A&M in 1998 and I purchased a house, the house that I bought, which was built in 1947, had a covenant, and that covenant was literally scratched out. So you could see and make sense of the words, but they literally blacked them out with a magic marker. In schools, again, the resistance to integration was overt and in your face, as you can see in this picture. Today, residential segregation is almost as high as it used to be back in the day, but the production of residential segregation has changed. Realtors can no longer tell us, hey, Black person, you cannot move in here. So what they do is they don't talk directly about race, but they do what researchers label as steering. So they steer people into white neighborhoods or black neighborhoods or Latino neighborhoods. We still have, obviously, these, particularly in apartments, a lot of discrimination in housing. And here you have the picture of Donald Trump, because his family, no, they were not the only ones. There were, I think, 185 other companies that were sued by the federal government, and all of them settled with the government, and they were caught discriminating. But the discrimination was of a new type. The way that we assess discrimination these days is through a technique called housing audit. So we send testers to apartment complexes or try to buy a house, and the testers are white or black or Latino, and they have the same profile, the same economic profile, and then we compare notes. And the funny thing is that often the black and Latino tester assumes that the treatment they received was fine, and later on the white tester says, oh wow, they told you they have apartments? They told me they had 4 apartments, yeah? So the language of discrimination has changed because in the normative and the rules of the game have changed, so they cannot do business the old-fashioned style, yeah? We already talked about redlining, so let me move to say that we also have it in stores, and people of color in the audience can relate to this. We're often monitored, so we have the clerk looking at us intensely, or sometimes we're ignored. Happened to me in fancy stores, where the clerks assume that I cannot purchase items, or we are killed with politeness. Yeah, I already mentioned that with the may I help you, may I help you, may I help you. And if you want more on that, check chapter 2 of my book, White Supremacy and Racism in the Post-Civil Rights Era. So to be clear, new racism strategies are dominant as part of this new system, but they are not the only things at play, because as I mentioned, a system emerges and becomes dominant or hegemonic, but that doesn't mean that everything old disappears completely. So this is the Klan. The Klan is still around. It doesn't have the same numbers that it used to have in the 1930s, but they're still around. And this is in the town where I live, Hillsborough, North Carolina. And they were objecting to a chocolatier. Happens to be a white chocolatier, but he's gay. And as you know, the Klan and all these white nationalist organizations combine concerns of race, gender, and sexual orientation in their politics. And we have the Proud Boys that became famous given that President Trump refused to condemn them outrightly. And we have the Boogaloo Boys, all kinds of boys. And again, that is an example of re-articulation, the articulation of the old and the new. So I already defined for you what systemic racism is. I gave you an illustration of the contemporary character of systemic racism. And now I want to address something that I think many of you in the audience know, which is the ideological expression of this system, which in my work I have called colorblind racism, to refer to the ideology that is anchored on the abstract extension of the principles of liberalism to race matters, to furnish seemingly non-racial explanations for all sorts of race-related issues. And in the book, for those interested, I talk about frames, I talk about the style of this ideology, and I talk about the racial stories, things such as, I did not own any slaves, so, and these stories are collective productions, so that's why we all recognize them, because we have heard them before. They're not individual sui generis things, but collective productions. Oh, I need a water break. Okay, so you saw my subliminal message about my book. My publisher forced me to do that. I wanted to give you one example of one of the frames of this ideology, and it's this notion of abstract liberalism, which I think is the core of the ideology. And the example is Jim, who is a computer salesman in his 40s, who was asked, Are you for or against affirmative action? And this was his answer. I think it's unfair top to bottom on everybody and the whole process. It often, discrimination itself is a bad word, right? But you discriminate every day. You want to buy a beer at the store, and there are 6 kinds of beers. You can get from natural light to Sam Adams, right? And you look at the price, and you look at the kind of beer, and it's a choice. And a lot of that you have laid out in front of you. Which one you get? Now, should the government sponsor Sam Adams and make it cheaper than natural light because it's brewed by someone in Boston? That doesn't make much sense, right? Why would we want that or make Sam Adams 8 times expensive because we want people to buy natural light? I always use this example to illustrate colorblind racism precisely because the language that Jim uses is not the language of the past. He's not using expletive, foul language. He's not using the odious racial language of the past. But I contend that what he's saying is an example of this colorblind racism. So let me explain. First, he has an abstract and decontextualized idea about discrimination. He seems to believe that discrimination for the most part is gone, except that discrimination in the labor market, actually, discrimination in the labor market, in the housing market, in the streets, everywhere in America is alive and well. And in the labor market specifically, it affects Black and Latino job applicants anywhere between 30 to 50% of the time. Secondly, Jim assumes that the market operates in meritocratic fashion, that the market will reward people based on their merits, except that market transactions, whether it's in the labor market, housing market, or any other element of the market, are fundamentally organized by networks. And networks in America are race-based. So whites have the most privileged networks and therefore have better access to jobs, job information, or housing information, etc. Now I want to move on and give you an example of how systemic racism becomes embedded in organizations. And I want to use the example of historically white colleges and universities, by which I mean that these organizations have a history, demography, curriculum, climate, and set of symbols and traditions that embody and reproduce whiteness. This organizational and cultural whiteness of HWCUs is responsible for the isolated incidents that happen in our colleges and for much, much, much more. But I wanted to give you 2 examples of the incidents we're talking about. On the left, you have the case of a sorority at Penn State some years ago. And it's a case that I care about because 58 years ago, I was born in Penn State. My parents were studying there, and I was born in that area. So I have always a memory and a fondness for Penn State. But Penn State, like Duke, like Columbia, like Yale, like Harvard, like Michigan, like Texas A&M, are all HWCUs. So in this case, the sorority decided to do a Mexican theme party, a Mexican theme party without Mexicans. So they are whites portraying themselves as Mexicans. And as you can see, the young woman in the front has a sign that reads, "I don't cut grass, I smoke it." And she thinks that's funny. The other picture is a picture of Asian students objecting to a Asian themed party at Duke University that was as offensive as the Mexican party in Penn State. And the Asian American students and their allies objected and make some demands to the university to remedy the situation. Now, these incidents matter, and we need to understand they are not isolated because they keep happening again and again and again. So they are the product of the organization and the culture. But I want to suggest that the issues around HWCUs are more than just these events that happen every now and then, yeah? So we have to understand that the entire curriculum of HWCUs is white-oriented. And I wrote a book on what I call white logic, that addresses the white logic of our thinking in the academy. Yeah? And the life in our colleges is white oriented, even though most whites don't think so, but it is. It is so white that even the food is white oriented. If I eat another chicken wrap sandwich, I will die. These colleges also have a set of symbols and traditions and even a culture that signify whiteness. And I want to give you a few examples. On the left, you have the statue of Silent Sam, Confederate statue at UNC. In the middle, you have what is called at Duke University, the President's Room. And all these President's Room, there are many, there's not only at Duke, but many universities have a similar room. And it's always pictures of older white men around the building or the room. And I have been fortunate enough to be invited to give talks in rooms like this. So I always make a joke, that's part of me. So I make a comment like, oh, this looks like the Klan room. And then I begin my talk. People of color laugh immediately. Then there is a delay, 5-6 seconds, while folks sort of laugh with less intensity. And then by the time that they cut the joke, I'm already in the middle of my talk. The next picture is a picture of Venus at the college in the West Coast. I forgot exactly which one. And Venus, as you know, is a symbol of beauty. The problem here is that if in the college we only represent beauty as white, then by omission, we're not also signifying the beauty of Blacks, indigenous people, Asian Americans, and Latinos. So what is the statue for me as a Black Puerto Rican telling me you are beautiful too? And as you can see, you see my picture, I'm handsome too. Hello? I thought that was a joke. Anyway, you also have building after building named after white people, which puts us in a situation following the Ralph Ellison novel that we feel that we are invisible people. We are in the spaces, but we are not recognized. And here you have an example of how we feel in these places. And it comes from a book by my former colleague, Joe Fagan, The Agony of Education. So Black student is telling about his visit to one of these colleges. And he says, one reason I didn't go there was because it reeked whiteness. And that is no joke. And I'm not exaggerating. I was only there for 2 days. And after 1 day, I wanted to leave. And I mean, really, it just reeked everywhere I went. It reeked of all white men. Just lily whiteness oozing from the corners. I wanted to leave, and I knew that socially I would just be miserable. And I talked to other Black students. I talked to all of them because they aren't a lot. And so I said, do you like it here? And they were like, no, we are miserable. If you want more on the way that emotions matter in systemic racism, check my presidential address of 2018, Feeling Race, Theorizing the Racial Economy of Emotions in the American Sociological Review. So what is the impact of these organizations, these HWCUs, on people of color? So in these places, we are not truly integrated. We just share space. We have spatial cohabitation. So because we're not seen as belonging, we're viewed with suspicion. Not surprisingly, campus police, as well as regular white folks, all acting as deputized agents of racial control, police us, particularly at night. And I wanted to give you 3 quick examples. My first job was at the University of Michigan. And in my second year, I went to the library to pick up some books. Remember back in the day, those of you of a certain age, we used to go to libraries and get books. So I'm going back to my office with 2 bags of books. Probably I have like 40 books. And I'm going back to my building where my office is located. And a white student, I think he was a graduate student, looked at me, gave me the, that look of, you seem to be out of place, and asked me, do you need any help? Sort of hinting that I was out of place. And he got me on a bad day, so I told him, actually, yes, I'm going back to my office. And I was wondering if you could carry some of the books so that I can do this quickly. And he noticed, he realized that he was wrong. So he did the, oh, I need to go. Thank you, bye-bye. And he left. The second incident wasn't as nice. It was extremely dangerous in my view. So it happened when I was a professor at Texas A&M University. I'm going at night to my office, and the campus police, and I'm going with one of my students, former students, now a professor, Tyrone Foreman. So we're going at 10 p.m. or so, and the campus police, while I'm parking the car, they stop the car, their car, and ask me, where are you going? I'm like, I'm going to my office. Office? What do you do here? I'm a professor. Professor of what? Sociology. Where is your office located? Academic building. What do you teach? As I told you, sociology. So he kept asking questions until finally he looked at us, gave us a deep look, and said, watch out because the campus is very dangerous at night. And he left, driving very slowly. So after this, I engaged in what some white people call self-segregation. Yeah, I call it intelligence. So I no longer go to the campus at night. So I have been now at Duke University for 15 years, and I don't go at night because I don't want to experience the possibility of brutality, the possibility of engagement with the campus police that are deleterious to my health, and encounters in which if I try to defend my interests and my dignity, I may end up dead. So this organizational expression of systemic racism is not limited to colleges. It's everywhere. It's in hospitals, it's in the military, it's in neighborhoods, it's in schools, that's your terrain, it's in churches, it's in banks, it's in everything. And if you want more on this, a paper by one of my former students, Victor Reid, outlines a theory of how race impacts organizations. And now comes the sensitive part, but we're going to do this together. Systemic racism ultimately is you. It's all of us. And I'm not calling anyone racist. I'm saying that something deeper. Yeah? We all participate of patriarchy and capitalism and racism because we're talking about something that is systemic. Systems remain in place because they find ways of incorporating most actors in society. Otherwise, the system would not survive. Capitalism cannot depend on elitist capitalists. Patriarchy cannot depend or survive based on the hyper-sexist people. We do have some, yeah? But the system doesn't depend on their actions to continue reproducing patriarchy. And similarly, in terms of racism, the system of racial domination doesn't depend on the so-called racists, but on the racism, and racism incorporates all of us. So most of us are probably very nice people, although some of you are angry birds, but we participate in various ways and degrees and in different positions in systemic racism. As I said, if something is systemic, it tries to incorporate all of us. And in terms of whites, participation in racism becomes normative, habituated, almost automatic. In whites, the conscious and the unconscious merge in what Du Bois called the souls of white folk. Let me begin by addressing briefly, how do people of color participate in systemic racism? And notice that I put that in the quotation marks, again, because our participation is not similar or symmetrical to that of whites. So since the slavery conquest period, most of us have been conscious and unwilling participants. Yeah? We're not like massa enslaved. We didn't ask to be enslaved. We have endured the negative economic, social, psychological, and health effects of systemic racism. But I said most people of color, because I recognize that, and we all need to be cognizant that some people of color have worked on behalf of white supremacy since slavery. So for example, during slavery, there was a family in Louisiana, the Metoyer family, and this family owned more than 200 enslaved Africans. The patriarch of the family wanted to and volunteered to fight to defend the Confederacy because he was trying to defend his race class interests, but the Confederate Army told him, nope, you cannot participate because you are black. So how do nice whites participate in systemic racism? And let me begin by again doing the caveat. Not all whites have participated in systemic racism. Some of them have died fighting against white supremacy. People like John Brown, the abolitionists, liberal folks in the 60s, again, some of them died fighting white supremacy. And in recent times, we have seen, literally, in the last few months, a number of whites fighting and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. But in general, most whites just keep trucking. They keep doing their thing. And let me explain why doing their thing reproduces systemic racism. So I begin by asking all of you, where do you live? Who are your friends? Is your church, mosque, synagogue, temple integrated? What school do you send your children to? What was your historical racial habitus when you were young? And has it changed in the last 20, 30, 40 years? Who challenges your ideas, thoughts, and emotions on race? And I hope you get my point. I'm suggesting that you navigate the white habitus, talking now to whites in the audience, that shapes you deeply. All the above things, where do you live, who are your friends, where do you send your children, your racial habitus, all these things contribute to the reproduction of the racial order of things in America without much fanfare, and arguably are more important factors than the so-called races in the reproduction of systemic racism. So what is to be done? Organization-wise, you must begin now, changing practices and rethinking everything. The Black Lives Matter is in the streets and has been pushing for radical, quick reform. I don't know about the quick reform, but we got to react to the movement, demanding racial justice and fairness. In the academy, as well as in schools, there are things that we should be doing, such as hiring people of color in cluster, so that we don't end up doing what we do, which is hire one person of color, lose two, hire two, lose one, and we end up more or less with the same situation. And if you happen to be in a university that is, for example, like Cornell, in the white boonies of America, so you know you're going to have problems attracting faculty of color, your job, your mission is, how do we bring enough to make a substantial change and create community so that they don't come here and feel alienated? One strategy that is successful is developing postdoctoral programs so that you bring people to the campus and maybe, just maybe, a number of them become later faculty in your institutions. And you have to increase the funding for diversity programs and initiatives. But of course, I'm talking about good diversity programs because we have plenty of them that are just nonsensical. And for schools across America, if you're an administrator of a school, you have to have a deep recognition that race matters and develop new ways of doing business. All these things will cost money. But you need to put your money where your mouth is. If you think it's an ethical issue, then follow through. And I want to say for you as people in the business of school administration, a book that came out a few years ago by Amanda Lewis and John Diamond showed what we people of color know, that it's not enough for people to say, I'm a good person, I have good intentions. Good people and good intentions may reproduce systemic racism in a variety of ways. And in this book, they show a school where it's a so-called integrated school, and the outcomes seem to be similar to any other school in America, suggesting the desperate need for structural reform. If the problem of systemic racism is systemic, your solutions need to be systemic too. So you need to address the organizational cultural whiteness in your units, whether it's a school or a department. And the goal must be to reimagine and reinvent your campus or school and transform them into truly multicultural spaces. And know that I'm not preaching to you to do something that I don't ask my own institution to do. And I gave a talk to my university, and about 5,000 people were in attendance. So I told them my truth. And it's important for us to recognize that schools and colleges are indeed special places. These are places of knowledge production, of creativity. And therefore, we can make these places, these institutions, beacons of racial fairness and justice, examples for the rest of the nation to follow. I already told you that I think that part of the problem is that systemic racism gets also embedded in the individual. Using the language of Karl Marx, we all become personifications of the system. So you heard what I said. You need to begin changing your life. And if you have a white life, you have to begin thinking about ways of making it a multicultural life. But I want you to recognize that the struggle against personal whiteness likely will be a long life struggle. Because so long as we have systemic racism in the air, that systemic racism will affect you, your cognitions, your opportunity structure, etc. So be humble that it's not enough for you to become a so-called anti-racist, but you have to understand that that anti-racism you're preaching has to be continuous, and that you have to recognize that you yourself are part of the problem. Lastly, anyone who knows me or my work knows that I do believe that fundamentally, if you want to produce change we can believe, like former President Obama would say, you need to rely not on electoral politics alone, but fundamentally, you have to depend on social movements. That's the way we became a nation. That's the way we ended slavery. That's the way we ended Jim Crow. That's the way that white women acquired the right to vote. So remember that this year we're celebrating 100 years of so-called women's right to vote. Let's be clear, white women, because black and brown women did not get the right to vote until the 1960s. Yeah? And today we have freedom movements all over the world, in Belarus, etc. And here in the old USA, we have a renewed and expanded Black Lives Matter movement. And with that, I want to end with a quote from Representative John Lewis, who passed away this year. Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Thank you. Fight the power.